Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be looking at the question, is empathy wrong? Now, earlier this week, Charlie Kirk was shot. We did a video on political violence a few months ago. Link in the card. So instead of talking about the actual act of his killing, this video is going to look at one of the positions that he held and debate that position on its merits. Specifically, a position which has become increasingly common on the political right, the claim that empathy is bad, toxic, or immoral. I would encourage you to watch the end of this video before commenting, but I do welcome any arguments that you have to offer for or against the points that are raised here. Now, before getting into the arguments, there are many ironies about Kirk's death. A man who defended gun rights to the point of saying that gun rights were worth the deaths of a few innocents every year was killed by a gun halfway through a sentence defending gun rights. A man who advocated for political violence, including the stoning of gay people, was killed in an act of political violence. Right-wing activists are unleashing their fury and threats against anyone that is not empathetic enough with the death of a man who derided the very concept of empathy as toxic. While these may show that particular individuals hold inconsistent viewpoints, it doesn't invalidate the underlying arguments. We are noting these ironies in the interest of taking them and setting them aside for the rest of the video. Instead, we're going to look at the philosophical arguments. 3 objections to the morality of the concept of empathy, as well as responses to these positions. Let's get started. So, first, what is empathy and why does it matter in philosophy? There are various exact definitions of the word in different disciplines. It shows up in things like psychology as well, but broadly, empathy identifies the ability of humans to understand and share the thoughts and feelings of other humans. The word empathy entered the English language in 1909 as the translation of the German Einfühlung. However, the concept can be traced much earlier to the works of David Hume, his A Treatise of Human Nature in 1739. Hume and Adam Smith, the father of economics, argued that empathy was not merely something that was morally permissible. It was the very thing that made us capable of being moral agents at all. It was the faculty that made moral judgments possible. Only through empathy can we understand that we have duties to other people and not just to our own self-interest. Hume and Smith argued that this empathy should be tempered by the perspective of an impartial spectator, by rationality, as well as steady and general points of view. But empathy itself is the core of morality for them. Now, how could we consider such a crucial component of our moral reasoning as immoral itself? How does empathy go from being the central thing that makes us moral agents to being something that is itself immoral, bad, and toxic? In this video, we're going to look at 3 different arguments against empathy in varying degrees, which have been offered at various points throughout history. First off, the claim that empathy is irrational. Second, the claim that empathy is biased. And third, the claim that empathy is infantilizing. We'll look at some objections to each of these arguments and then do our best to see if they can stand up under scrutiny. So, the first objection to this viewpoint comes not from a modern conservative, but rather from Immanuel Kant, responding to Hume's arguments. Kant argued that reason and rationality should be the core faculties used in assessing the morality of a given action. He argues that duties can be derived from reason alone and do not require empathy to figure out what we're required to do. Empathy, to Kant, was subjective and not universally applicable, and therefore not something that we should form the basis of our morality. Unlike Hume, Kant argued that it was our ability to engage in moral reasoning, the rationality of it, not our capability for empathy, that made humans worthy of moral status. Now, there are a few problems with Kant's view. First, Kant bakes empathy into his famous categorical imperative. The categorical imperative is formulated in several different ways in Kant's work, but one of them claims that you should not do actions which, if they were universalized, would lead to a contradiction. Inherent in this process of universalizing, though, is having empathy for everyone around you, understanding what would happen if they took that action as well. Inherently putting yourself in someone else's shoes. The process of universalizing, of testing out whether or not a particular action would be moral based on Kant's categorical imperative, is an empathetic process. It is a process of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. Kant is basically saying, what would happen if everyone did that? How can we understand this question without putting ourselves into the shoes of others and seeing the impact of our actions on them? How can we understand the impacts of everyone stealing without putting ourselves into everyone else's shoes? Another way Kant formulates his imperative is that we should not use others as a means to an end, but as an end in themselves. Similarly, utilizing this maxim seems impossible without empathy, without being able to put yourself in someone else's place and understanding whether your actions are using them as a means to an end or as an end in themselves. Perhaps you might think of it as something that would be using them as a means to an end, but they actually view it as you using them as an end in themselves. And without that empathy, without understanding their perspective of how they would view that action and how they would take that action, you are unable to decide whether a given action validates or follows Kant's categorical imperative. Even if we're building our maxims out of rationality, it seems that empathy has a key place in evaluating how these maxims are applied. Next, Kant's views don't quite fit the bill of this modern conservative conception of empathy being toxic. Unlike the modern conservatives, he's not arguing that empathy is bad or immoral, just that it doesn't deserve the same primacy of place that it was given by Hume. It's challenging to see how Kant would view feeling empathy for others as immoral, as viewing them only as a means to an end, or as something that would cause a contradiction if it was universalized. This doesn't seem like Kant would be out there saying that we have a duty to be unempathetic to others. Finally, I'm not convinced that empathy isn't universal, as Kant claims. If you're doing empathy correctly, you're actually understanding what others are feeling. How your actions make someone feel is a real universal fact about the world. How they're feeling is a real fact that you can perceive with empathy in the same way that you perceive things with your other senses. In fact, this only becomes particularized to you when you fail at having empathy and imagine someone as having feelings or beliefs that they don't have, or fail to put yourself in someone else's shoes in the same way that your other senses might make a mistake about something in the world. Now, a quick aside. There are some on both sides of the political spectrum who argue that empathy is somehow a new phenomenon, that it is a new trend that is either leading to greater liberation of the oppressed, if you're on the left, or completely destroying Western civilization, if you're on the right. Kirk himself said that empathy is a made-up New Age term. I hope that the fact that this debate has been going on since at least before America was a country should put these arguments to bed. Hume, who held some admittedly racist views, was a proponent of empathy as a core feature of morality. So the idea that the concept of empathy is a brand new thing that is suddenly making us realize we should have all of these social justice revolutions seems unfounded. Likewise, the fact that Adam Smith, the father of economics and the modern Western system of capitalism, supported the idea of empathy as the underpinning of morality should easily dismiss the argument that empathy is in any way harming Western civilization or was only created in the last few decades. Empathy was a key component of the viewpoints of the father of capitalism and has been around for hundreds of years. It isn't something that is destroying our civilization. It has been a central part of it for centuries. Another argument against empathy, which has been raised from both figures on the right, like Ben Shapiro, as well as figures on the left, is the idea that empathy is inherently biased. It is an empirical fact that we are more empathetic to those who look like us, sound like us, or are physically close to us. Beyond demographic characteristics, we're more likely to empathize with someone in close physical proximity than someone that's far away. There are other ways that our empathy can be manipulated through a range of psychological techniques. Think of the old ASPCA ad where they show images of abused cats and dogs with the "In the Arms of an Angel" playing in the background. The challenge is that you feel empathy not because of rational or moral reasons, but because you're being manipulated into feeling it. On the inverse, you can be conditioned and manipulated to see certain groups of people as not really human, as dehumanized, as objects, and therefore you feel less or no empathy towards them even when they don't have fewer rights or they don't have lower moral standing. And so empathy may end up being a bad indicator of moral standing in these cases. Now, there are several issues with this critique. First, the failing of an individual or a group of people to empathize with groups more distant from them does not diminish the concept of empathy itself. It merely points to ways we need to better educate people about how to do empathy better. Think of it this way. Simply because people commit logical fallacies, and we've seen and have shown that people are psychologically predisposed to be bad at logic and to commit fallacies, it doesn't mean that logic is therefore broken, or rationality itself is a useless concept and we should just give up on being rational. Similarly, just because people fail to empathize with everyone equally doesn't mean that empathy is bad, immoral, or harmful, simply that people are bad at having empathy. Empathy is the ability to feel what others are feeling, and if you can only have empathy for certain kinds of people, you're doing a bad job of having empathy. Empathy is not at fault. You are. In the same way that just because a kid fails a math test doesn't mean we throw out the concept of math, just because there are a lot of people that are bad at having empathy or struggle to have empathy, it doesn't mean we need to get rid of the concept as an underpinning of morality. It means that we need to get people to be doing empathy better, just like we need to teach the kid to do math better. And we should be teaching everyone to do logic better. Second, this is the case for tempering empathy with reason, as Hume and Smith advocate, not throwing it out altogether. Empathy may occasionally get things wrong. That doesn't make it immoral. Acting blindly on empathy without reflection and rational thought, though, might risk doing something immoral. But the fact that feeling empathy itself is not wrong, nor should be acting based on a combination of empathy and reason. Third, this fails to deliver on the larger points that conservatives are trying to make. The right is trying to limit empathy that is felt towards people that don't look like you, who live in different places, who believe in a different religion from you, who came to the country after they were born instead of being born here, etc. The whole America first, or insert your country here first ideology, that those closer to you should be given higher priority than those further away. They don't want you to feel empathy towards people who are further away. They want to rely on these biases. Check out our video on Ordo Amoris for more on the theological attempts to justify this position. In this way, the fact that people feel more empathy for those that look like them is a feature, not a bug. It's a reason they should embrace empathy, not reject it. They only get mad when people rationally attempt to overcome those biases and apply empathy equally to everyone and say, hey, maybe we should actually be empathetic with these people that are in other countries who small amounts of foreign assistance could help prevent from starving. Now, the third and final argument we'll look at here against empathy is the claim that empathy in some way limits the freedom of others, that it overly infantilizes them. This argument specifically can be found in the works of Jordan Peterson, though varying versions of it exist across conservative thinkers who have long advocated against any social services with the idea that people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. The basic idea of this argument is as follows. If you have empathy for someone, you will coddle them, not allow them to make their own mistakes and grow into their full potential. You limit their freedom by feeling sorry for them and giving them something they didn't earn. They become dependent on you and fail to ever have the freedom to do things or choose things themselves. They become a burden to you and lose their own autonomy, a loss for you as well as a loss for them. Your empathy causes harm to you and it causes harm to them. Now, there are a range of issues we might raise with this argument as well. First, there's a difference between empathy and what you do with that empathy. You can feel empathy for someone who's shivering out in the woods with no heat. That empathy, though, does not prescribe what you should do to help them. You could choose to build a fire for them, or you could choose to teach them to build a fire. It prescribes that you help them. It doesn't prescribe how you help them. There's nothing inherent to empathy that requires one to provide assistance which leads to dependency, nor is there anything inherent to it which requires you to provide assistance which leads to independence. Empathy is simply providing you the empathetic, that sharing of emotions with someone that gives you a sense that maybe you should help them. It doesn't say how you should help them. Second, to further illustrate this mistake, you could imagine a situation where there is no empathy, but dependence is still created. For For example, many conservative households enforce strict rules on their children, not out of empathy, but out of a desire for hierarchy and obedience. However, many of these children, once they go out into the world, struggle to cope without these rules and engage in self-destructive behavior because they don't have those rules to rely on. They've become dependent on those rules. These households have created a dependence in their children, not out of empathy, but out of this desire for obedience. They've created this dependence on an external rule enforcer. This limits their children's independence and freedom just as surely as someone that gave them too much support out of a sense of empathy. Providing dependence or providing independence is a separate concept for whether or not you have empathy for someone. The next issue with this argument is that it fails to distinguish between those things that one can learn oneself and those things that we actually need support for. Individuals must have their basic needs met before they can achieve their own autonomy. Someone that is dying in an emergency room cannot go out and get a job to pay for the surgery they need. A person without a home may need basics like a shower and clean clothes before they can pick themselves up by their proverbial bootstraps. Our empathy helps us realize when there are people in real need who need some amount of basics to get themselves to a point where they can achieve that autonomy. And fourth, and this is where all of these pieces come together, our empathy, if used well, can help us to understand when people don't actually need assistance or would be further harmed by our assistance. The ironic piece of Peterson's argument is that the reason we think that not letting someone achieve their full potential is wrong is our empathy for them. We have empathy for the idea of someone that fails to reach their full potential, that fails to do all the things they could do because they never face real consequences for our actions. We know that having some real consequences for our actions can drive us to try harder or do better because we empathize with the negative feelings of being coddled. That empathy helps us to understand that these may be people who should be helped, but there are more and less effective ways to help them. If we're using our empathy correctly, we can empathize not just with that need, but with the possible positive and negative consequences that different types of intervention can have. We can't get to that point without at least some empathy. We can't understand the harm that we could do by intervening in some ways to cause dependence without empathizing with that person's situation of being in a situation of dependence and how negative that is. But we can also use that same empathy to recognize when our assistance is going to provide them with the support structures that are needed for them to achieve independence and freedom, and when that is going to provide not enough real consequences for them to become, therefore, dependent. And so it is not empathy that restrains these things, but rather the empathy that we need to use to determine when and where these pieces of assistance are appropriate. So, is empathy toxic? I'm not convinced. It seems like empathy should be tempered with logic, and unreflective empathy can lead to poor decisions. But decisions completely divorced of empathy seem to be just as harmful, if not more so. Empathy might not be the end-all, be-all of moral faculties, but it seems like even those which try to escape it, which try to say we should base our morality on something other than empathy, keep falling back into empathy and keep needing to rely on empathy in one way or another for their faculties to function. What do you think? Is empathy morally permissible? If we temper empathy with rationality, does it resolve these concerns that these thinkers have expressed? Is there such a thing as too much empathy? Or is it not empathy that's at fault, but the actions we take based on that empathy? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.